John Keats was born in London in 1795 on Halloween Day. So next Halloween, you can remember that it's also John Keats' birthday. His father was an ostler, which is the guy who looks after the horses belonging to a people staying at an inn at the Swan and Hoop Inn, which his father-in-law, Keats' mother's father, owned. Keats' father died and the family was left in a difficult financial position. He was able to get a limited classical education, but he was not rich. Some of his early influences included Torquato Tasso, who was a 16th century Italian poet best known for having written an epic poem called Jerusalem Delivered, which gives an imaginative account of the fighting between the Christians and Muslims at the end of the First Crusade during the siege of Jerusalem in 1099. He also read Edmund Spenser, a 16th century English poet best known for The Faerie Queene, which is an epic celebrating the Tudor dynasty and the reign of Elizabeth I in particular. He also read the translations of George Chapman, who was a late 16th, early 17th century English poet who translated the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the Batrachomyomachia, which is a parody on the Iliad that was believed to have been written between the 4th and 6th centuries BC, and whose name translates to something like the War of the Frogs and Mice. And by the way, in case you were wondering, the name for that text in German is Frosch-Mäuse-Krieg, which is both fun to say and has the added benefit of being one of those German words whose etymology is clear to an English speaker even who doesn't speak German. So Frosch must be frog, and Mäuse is mouse, and Krieg is, of course, war. Frosch-Mäuse-Krieg, the War of the Frogs and Mice. Any German speakers out there, please excuse my pronunciation. And both the names Spenser and Chapman appear in Keats's poetry. Spenser comes up a couple times, and Chapman at least once. In fact, his first poem was called An Imitation of Spenser, and he wrote it when he was 19. One thing that the German composer Johann Sebastian Bach was known for is copying the manuscripts of other composers by hand as a means of studying them and imitating their style. And he did this even for composers like Telemann, who, though great in their own way, were contemporaries of Bach and today are not as well known as Bach is. But all the same, during his lifetime, Bach was doing everything that he could to learn from his contemporaries and from whatever source that he could learn from, which is certainly part of how he became so great. But it's interesting to see that something comparable goes on in poetry, in that here you have Keats trying to imitate the style of Spenser. There are a few examples of that in his poetry. And that's, of course, not quite the same as copying his poetry out by hand. But it's interesting to think about imitating the styles of other artists, of other people doing whatever it is that you do, not in order to become a copy of them or to steal their ideas, but to see how they do it and to see maybe if there's anything to benefit from, to learn from in their approach, and to have their style or a version of it in your toolkit. And this is a method that applies not only to high art like music and poetry, but to almost any skilled craft that you could think of today, in which it's possible to vary the approach to what you're doing. And because Keats's family was in a difficult financial situation, he was also studying medicine, and his family hoped that he would someday become a doctor. And indeed, when he was 19, around the same time as when he wrote his first poem, he also received his apothecary's license, so he could work as an apothecary, which is an older word for what we today would call a pharmacist, not somebody who treats patients, but somebody who can sell medicine. The publisher with whom Keats worked for the longest was Taylor and Hesse, which was located on Fleet Street, a legendary area of London which since the 16th century has been known for publishing, especially newspapers. And Taylor and Hesse also published the work of, among many others, Samuel Taylor Coleridge and Thomas Carlyle, at some of whose writing we've looked on this podcast. The year 1819 in particular was a very productive year for Keats. In that year, he wrote his 6 odes. The ode on a Grecian urn, on indolence, on melancholy, to a nightingale, to Psyche, and to autumn. And these 6 in particular are taken to be some of Keats's best poetry. And in the same year, he was taking care of his brother Tom, who eventually died. And it's generally thought that John got tuberculosis during this time and he gradually became sicker and sicker until he died in 1821. Joseph Severn, who was a painter and a good friend of Keats, looked after him while he was sick, and in a letter to a friend wrote of Keats's death, quote, "About 4, the approaches of death came on. Keats said, 'Severn, lift me up. I'm dying. I shall die easy. Don't be frightened. Be firm, and thank God it has come.' I lifted him up in my arms. The phlegm seemed boiling in his throat, and increased until 11, when he gradually sank into death, so quiet that I still thought he slept." End quote. It's worth acknowledging that according to someone who was there, Keats did his best to meet his death calmly and firmly. Maybe he was even reminding himself. He said, "I shall die easy. Don't be frightened. Be firm, and thank God it has come." And as the cover for this episode, I used a portrait of Keats by Joseph Severn, by his friend, which was done in 1819, which was not only when Keats was still alive, but it was the most productive year of his short life. And the most famous portrait of Keats is by William Hilton. You've probably seen it. And it's perhaps a bit more clean than this one by Severn, but it was done in 1822. It was done after Keats's death. And while Hilton and Keats knew each other, they weren't friends as far as I can tell, the way that Keats and Severn were. So there's something a little special about this portrait by Severn, this guy who was with Keats at his death, and also his portrait has a kind of energy and intensity to it that I like. So Keats died in February 1821 in Rome at the age of 25, and he's buried in the Protestant cemetery in Rome. His gravestone reads in part, apparently at his request, quote, "Here lies one whose name was writ in water," end quote. Percy Bysshe Shelley was a poet himself, as well as being a friend of Keats and the husband of Mary Shelley, author of Frankenstein, an edition of which I have printed and made available on my website for a good price and free shipping with original cover art and excellent print quality. The link is in the description. I hope you'll go get yourself a copy. But Shelley wrote for Keats and completed in April of 1821, 2 months after Keats's death, a poem of 495 lines titled Adonais, an elegy on the death of John Keats, author of Endymion, Hyperion. And this is regarded as one of Shelley's best poems. The ashes of Shelley, who often advocated for Keats, are buried in the same Protestant cemetery in Rome, and Joseph Severn was buried immediately next to Keats. And though it was a close race, it might be said that Keats won the charge of geniuses into oblivion. He died at 25. Shelley died only a year later at the age of 29. Emily Bronte died at 30. Lord Byron died at 36. And there were composers in this race also. Schubert died at 31, Bellini at 33, Mozart at 35, and both Purcell and Bizet died at 36. But I'm not aware of someone who has had greater literary influence, or artistic influence for that matter, who died younger than Keats. But it's not the kind of thing that's very easy to Google, so if you can think of any examples, let me know. And while I was reading about Keats's death, I was wondering why information about the death and burial of great men is interesting. And I think it's in part because thinking about their death is an acknowledgement that whatever you believe spiritually or religiously about an afterlife, culturally and historically, for certain people, death is not the end. And in fact, in some cases, like Keats, the part of their story during which they have greater impact is after their death. They are culturally still around. They just may not be conscious of it. His remains are in the ground in Rome, but we are still reading his poetry. Meanwhile, there are all kinds of people walking around on the earth today who are contributing far less to our lives than him. So death is not a serious barrier to great men. It's a kind of logistical detail. His mortal coil may be in Rome, but his words are, thanks to the internet, available worldwide and are as full of life as when the ink that first bore them was still wet. This involves a kind of non-linear view of history in which the relevance of people and their art are uncoupled from the time elapsed between the current year and the year of their birth, and the work of great men of the past stands as a forest of majestic trees, many of which are hundreds, some of them thousands of years old, and they will continue for as long as we value them. Keats and the others at whose work we've looked might as well be guests on this podcast. I'm just reading out their part for them. So put another way, my next guest, though he's remembered as one of the greatest poets of the English language, had been only writing poetry seriously for about 6 years when he died, and publishing for only 4. And it's estimated that during his lifetime, he sold about 200 copies in total of the 3 volumes of poetry that he published. By February of 1820, he knew he was dying and wrote in a letter, quote, "I have left no immortal work behind me, nothing to make my friends proud of my memory, but I have loved the principle of beauty in all things, and if I had had the time, I would have made myself remembered," end quote. And it's not every day that you get to prove a great historical literary figure wrong, but you and I, by reading and reflecting on the writing of John Keats more than 2 centuries after his death, have the pleasure of being able to do just that. So let's get to it. The edition that I'm reading from includes some letters of Keats, and I first want to read a few passages from those as a warm-up because letters are a little bit more accessible than poetry, and so we can hear Keats perhaps a little more clearly as an ordinary person, as a guy who was trying to do his work carefully and well and trying to figure out exactly what that meant and how to do it. In 1818, he writes, quote, "In poetry I have a few axioms, and you will see how far I am from their center. First, I think poetry should surprise by a fine excess and not by singularity. It should strike the reader as a wording of his own highest thoughts and appear almost a remembrance. Second, its touches of beauty should never be halfway, thereby making the reader breathless instead of content. The rise, the progress, the setting of imagery should, like the sun, come natural to him, shine over him, and set soberly, although in magnificence leaving him in the luxury of twilight. But it is easier to think what poetry should be than to write it. And this leads me on to another axiom, that if poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all," end quote. I like that he points out it is easier to think what poetry should be than to write it. I think that applies in a lot of cases. It's very easy to articulate what something ought to be, what you're trying to do, and it's harder to actually do it. And he says the bit at the end about poetry coming naturally, that if poetry comes not as naturally as the leaves to a tree, it had better not come at all. But apparently Keats worked on his poems as much as anybody. He revised them, he adjusted them. So that shouldn't be any discouragement to anybody who feels like poetry or writing doesn't come so naturally to them. In another letter he writes, quote, "I find that I can have no enjoyment in the world but continual drinking of knowledge. I find there is no worthy pursuit but the idea of doing some good for the world. Some do it with their society, some with their wit, some with their benevolence, some with a sort of power of conferring pleasure and good humor on all they meet, and in 1,000 ways all equally dutiful to the command of great nature. There is but one way for me. The road lies through application, study, and thought," end quote. Later he writes, quote, "An extensive knowledge is needful to thinking people. It takes away the heat and fever, and helps, by widening speculation, to ease the burden of the mystery, a thing I begin to understand a little," end quote. Easing the burden of the mystery. Maybe that's what we're trying to do when we're learning things. And this next one is the last passage that I want to read from his letters. It's a little longer, and it describes his spiritual view of life. Keats writes, quote, "The common cognomen of this world, among the misguided and superstitious, is a vale of tears, from which we are to be redeemed by a certain arbitrary interposition of God and taken to heaven. What a little circumscribed, straitened notion! Call the world, if you please, the vale of soul-making. Then you will find out the use of the world. I am speaking now in the highest terms for human nature, admitting it to be immortal, which I will here take for granted for the purpose of showing a thought which has struck me concerning it. I say soul-making, soul as distinguished from an intelligence. There may be intelligence, or sparks of the divinity in millions, but they are not souls till they acquire identities, till each one is personally itself. Intelligences are atoms of perception. They know, and they see, and they are pure. In short, they are God. How then are souls to be made? How then are these sparks, which are God, to have identity given them, so as ever to possess a bliss peculiar to each one's individual existence? How, but by the medium of a world like this? This point I sincerely wish to consider, because I think it a grander system of salvation than the Christian religion, or rather it is a system of spirit creation. This is effected by three grand materials acting the one upon the other for a series of years. These three materials are the intelligence, the human heart, as distinguished from intelligence or mind, and the world, or elemental space, suited for the proper action of mind and heart on each other for the purpose of forming the soul or intelligence destined to possess the sense of identity. I can scarcely express what I but dimly perceive, and yet I think I perceive it. That you may judge the more clearly, I will put it in the most homely form possible. I will call the world a school, instituted for the purpose of teaching little children to read. I will call the human heart the horn book used in that school, and I will call the child able to read the soul made from that school and its horn book. Do you not see how necessary a world of pains and troubles is to school an intelligence and make it a soul, a place where the heart must feel and suffer in 1,000 diverse ways? Not merely is the heart a horn book, it is the mind's Bible, it is the mind's experience, it is the teat from which the mind or intelligence sucks its identity. As various as the lives of men are, so various become their souls, and thus does God make individual beings, souls, identical souls of the sparks of his own essence. This appears to me a faint sketch of a system of salvation which does not affront our reason and humanity." End quote. So he's giving this vision of life as a means of converting intelligences into souls, that the intelligence is a divine spark, and by running it through this system, this world, it has the potential to find its own identity and become a soul, which he might say is an individualized intelligence. It's an intelligence with an identity. And from the way he's writing about it, and he's writing in a letter, he's not necessarily saying, "This is my view of the world," but he was a guy in his early 20s thinking about stuff, and this came into his mind, and he liked it, so he wrote to somebody about it. And the first poem that I want to show you by John Keats is titled "To Hope," and it's 8 verses, 6 lines each. And just in case there's anyone out there who's not used to reading or listening to this kind of poetry, I'd say a few things. One, don't worry if you can't follow every line. Try to think about the meaning, but if you get a little lost, then you can just enjoy the sound of it, the meter, the rhythm, the rhyme, until you can pick up again what he's talking about. And even long poems are short but dense. Of course, we're talking about a writer who has thought very carefully about every syllable here. So it would be ordinary to read a poem twice or even a dozen times, or if you're doing a real close reading, perhaps hundreds of times. But today we're going to enjoy them largely at the surface level. We're going to hear the sound of them. We're going to draw some interesting ideas from them. There's a lot of things in life that are ugly, painful, difficult to deal with, difficult to think about. A good poem is something that, whatever else is in it, it has an aesthetic beauty that is good for its own sake. And just as a guideline for this first poem we're going to be looking at, if I remember correctly, pretty much every verse is essentially saying, when I'm feeling bad, let hope come to me and let me feel better. And a word that he uses several times in this poem is pinion, which is a type of feather on a bird. It's one of the outermost feathers. So when he says pinion, you can think of feathers. John Keats writes, quote, "When by my solitary hearth I sit, and hateful thoughts enwrap my soul in gloom, when no fair dreams before my mind's eye flit, and the bare heath of life presents no bloom, sweet hope, ethereal balm upon me shed, and wave thy silver pinions o'er my head. Whene'er I wander at the fall of night, where woven boughs shut out the moon's bright ray, should sad despondency my musings fright, and frown to drive fair cheerfulness away, peep with the moonbeams through the leafy roof, and keep that fiend despondence far aloof. Should disappointment, parent of despair, strive for her son to seize my careless heart, when like a cloud he sits upon the air, preparing on his spellbound prey to dart, chase him away, sweet hope, with visage bright, and fright him as the morning frightens night. Whene'er the fate of those I hold most dear tells to my fearful breast a tale of sorrow, O bright-eyed hope, my morbid fancy cheer, let me awhile thy sweetest comforts borrow, thy heaven-born radiance around me shed, and wave thy silver pinions o'er my head. Should e'er unhappy love my bosom pain from cruel parents or relentless fare, O let me think it is not quite in vain to sigh out sonnets to the midnight air. Sweet hope, ethereal balm upon me shed, and wave thy silver pinions o'er my head. In the long vista of the years to roll, let me not see our country's honor fade. Oh, let me see our land retain her soul, her pride, her freedom, and not freedom's shade. From thy bright eyes unusual brightness shed, beneath thy pinions canopy my head. Let me not see the patriot's high bequest, great liberty, how great in plain attire, with the base purple of a court oppressed, bowing her head and ready to expire. But let me see thee stoop from heaven on wings that fill the skies with silver glitterings. And as in sparkling majesty a star gilds the bright summit of some gloomy cloud, brightening the half-veiled face of heaven afar, so when dark thoughts my boding spirit shroud, sweet hope, celestial influence round me shed, waving thy silver pinions o'er my head. End quote. Hang on, let's hear that 6th verse again. Quote, in the long vista of the years to roll, let me not see our country's honor fade. Oh, let me see our land retain her soul, her pride, her freedom, and not freedom's shade. From thy bright eyes unusual brightness shed, beneath thy pinions canopy my head. That's pretty good. And for many or most of these, I'm going to read not the whole poem, but a section of the poem. Not because the rest of the poem isn't good, but since that is what caught my attention, I figure that will be the most interesting to you as well on a first pass. This is a section from a poem called To My Brother George. In this section, he talks mostly about two things. One is the thoughts and sensed things that a poet enjoys during his lifetime, and then the second one being what happens to a great poet after his death, that people are inspired by his writings and use them in various contexts. Keats writes, quote, these wonders strange he sees and many more, whose head is pregnant with poetic lore. Should he upon an evening ramble fare with forehead to the soothing breezes bare, would he not see but the dark silent blue with all its diamonds trembling through and through? Or the coy moon, when in the waviness of whitest clouds she does her beauty dress, and stayedly paces higher up and higher like a sweet nun in holiday attire. Ah yes, much more would start into his sight, the revelries and mysteries of night. And should I ever see them, I will tell you such tales as needs must with amazement spell you. These are the living pleasures of the bard, but richer far posterity's award. What does he murmur with his latest breath, while his proud eye looks through the film of death? What though I leave this dull and earthly mold, yet shall my spirit lofty converse hold with aftertimes. The patriot shall feel my stern alarum and unsheath his steel, or in the senate thunder out my numbers to startle princes from their easy slumbers. The sage will mingle with each moral theme, my happy thoughts sententious. He will teem with lofty periods when my verses fire him, and then I'll stoop from heaven to inspire him. End quote. This next poem, titled, O Solitude, If I Must With Thee Dwell, is relatively short, so I'll read the whole thing. And in this one he says, if I have to be alone, rather than being in a city, I'd rather be alone in nature. And then he describes a nice, natural scene. Quote, O solitude, if I must with thee dwell, let it not be among the jumbled heap of murky buildings. Climb with me the steep nature's observatory, whence the dell, its flowery slopes, its rivers crystal swell, may seem a span. Let me thy vigils keep mongst boughs pavilioned, where the deer's swift leap startles the wild bee from the foxglove bell. But though I'll gladly trace these scenes with thee, yet the sweet converse of an innocent mind, whose words are images of thoughts refined, is my soul's pleasure, and it sure must be almost the highest bliss of humankind when to thy haunts two kindred spirits flee. End quote. And this next one, along similar lines, is titled, To One Who Has Been Long in City Pent, meaning to one who's been in a city for too long. And in this one, he's saying how nice it is for someone who's spent too much time in the city to be able to get out in nature and see the night sky and read a book and relax. Keats writes, and I know there are times when I certainly could have related to that sentiment. Maybe you can as well, and this one is going out to you. Keats writes, quote, To one who has been long in city pent, 'tis very sweet to look into the fair and open face of heaven, to breathe a prayer full in the smile of the blue firmament. Who is more happy when, with heart's content fatigued, he sinks into some pleasant lair of wavy grass and reads a debonair and gentle tale of love and languishment? Returning home at evening with an ear catching the notes of Philomel, and eye watching the sailing cloudlet's bright career, he mourns that day so soon has glided by, e'en like the passage of an angel's tear that falls through the clear ether silently. End quote. This next one is called On the Grasshopper and Cricket, and it's about nature generally. And he compares the grasshopper jumping around in the hot summer to the cricket chirping in the winter. And he's talking about how nature is beautiful no matter what time of year it is. Keats writes, quote, "The poetry of earth is never dead. When all the birds are faint with the hot sun and hide in cooling trees, a voice will run from hedge to hedge about the new-mown mead. That is the grasshopper's. He takes the lead in summer luxury. He has never done with his delights, for when tired out with fun, he rests at ease beneath some pleasant weed. The poetry of earth is ceasing never. On a lone winter evening when the frost has wrought a silence from the stove, there shrills the cricket's song, in warmth increasing ever, and seems to one in drowsiness half lost, the grasshoppers among some grassy hills." End quote. This next one is called Happy is England. Here he says, "England is great. It has beautiful nature, even though I do sometimes think about Italian skies and visiting the Alps." And then he says, "English women are wonderful. They're very beautiful, though sometimes I think about women from other places as well." Keats writes, quote, "Happy is England. I could be content to see no other verdure than its own, to feel no other breezes than are blown through its tall woods with high romances blent. Yet do I sometimes feel a languishment for skies Italian, and an inward groan to sit upon an Alp as on a throne, and half forget what world or worldling meant. Happy is England, sweet her artless daughters, enough their simple loveliness for me, enough their whitest arms in silence clinging. Yet do I often warmly burn to see beauties of deeper glance, and hear their singing, and float with them among the summer waters." End quote. This next one is a section from a poem called Sleep and Poetry. And in the section that I'm reading, he's basically praising sleep, which when you're a kid, the last thing that you want to do is sleep. But when you're an adult, you get to the end of the day and you're really ready to go to sleep. Or at least I am, or I try to be. If I find myself feeling a little happy at getting into bed, I know that I've worked hard that day. If I really want to go to sleep. Keats writes, quote, "What is more gentle than a wind in summer? What is more soothing than the pretty hummer that stays one moment in an open flower and buzzes cheerily from bower to bower? What is more tranquil than a musk rose blowing in a green island far from all men's knowing, more healthful than the leafiness of dales, more secret than a nest of nightingales, more serene than Cordelia's countenance, more full of visions than a high romance? What but thee, sleep, soft closer of our eyes, low murmurer of tender lullabies, light hoverer around our happy pillows, wreather of poppy buds and weeping willows, silent entangler of a beauty's tresses, most happy listener, when the morning blesses thee for enlivening all the cheerful eyes that glance so brightly at the new sunrise." End quote. And later on in the same poem, quote, "Stop and consider. Life is but a day, a fragile dewdrop on its perilous way from a tree's summit, a poor Indian's sleep while his boat hastens to the monstrous steep of Montmorency. Why so sad a moan? Life is the rose's hope while yet unblown, the reading of an ever-changing tale, the light uplifting of a maiden's veil, a pigeon tumbling in clear summer air, a laughing schoolboy without grief or care, riding the springy branches of an elm." End quote. And Keats has several poems that are much longer. Here's a section from one of those called Lamia. And this passage is a bit of commentary on the effect of philosophy and science, or the possible effect of it on things traditionally thought of as beautiful and imaginative. And Keats seemed to have been interested in philosophy and exploration, but this is an interesting commentary that reflects what some of the literary figures of this period were dealing with, which is the barging of science and philosophy into structures, areas of life, into which they were traditionally thought to be not welcome. Keats writes, quote, "Do not all charms fly at the mere touch of cold philosophy? There was an awful rainbow once in heaven. We know her woof, her texture. She is given in the dull catalogue of common things. Philosophy will clip an angel's wings, conquer all mysteries by rule and line, empty the haunted air and gnomed mine, unweave a rainbow, as it erewhile made the tender-personed Lamia melt into a shade." End quote. And this next one is a section from a poem called Fancy, referring to what we would also call the imagination. And he's saying, if you stop holding on to your imagination, if you let it go, it will do what it does naturally. Keats writes, Quote, ever let the fancy roam, pleasure never is at home, at a touch sweet pleasure melteth, like to bubbles when rain pelteth. Then let winged fancy wander through the thought still spread beyond her, open wide the mind's cage door, she'll dart forth and cloudward soar, O sweet fancy, let her loose. Summer's joys are spoilt by use, and the enjoying of the spring fades as does its blossoming. Autumn's red-lipped fruitage too, blushing through the mist and dew, cloys with tasting. What do then? Sit thee by the ingle when the sear faggot blazes bright, spirit of a winter's night, when the soundless earth is muffled and the caked snow is shuffled from the ploughboy's heavy shoon, when the night doth meet the noon in a dark conspiracy to banish even from her sky. Sit thee there and send abroad, with a mind self-overawed, fancy, high-commissioned, send her. End quote. And just in case you forgot that Keats was a guy in his early 20s when he was writing these, this next one is a poem called Lines on the Mermaid Tavern, and it's a poem about a bar he liked, apparently called the Mermaid Tavern. And first he talks about how delicious the food and drink is there, and then he tells a little story about the sign blowing away. He writes, quote, souls of poets dead and gone, what Elysium have ye known? Happy field or mossy cavern, choicer than the Mermaid Tavern? Have ye tippled drink more fine than mine host's canary wine? Or are fruits of paradise sweeter than those dainty pies of venison? O generous food, dressed as though bold Robin Hood would with his maid Marian sup and bowse from horn and can. I have heard that on a day mine host's signboard flew away, nobody knew whither, till an astrologer's old quill to a sheepskin gave the story, said he saw you in your glory underneath a new old sign, sipping beverage divine, and pledging with contented smack the mermaid in the zodiac. Souls of poets dead and gone, what Elysium have ye known? Happy field or mossy cavern, choicer than the Mermaid Tavern. End quote. And this next one is called On Peace, and he's reflecting on the future of England and of Europe. And he wrote this in 1814, which is toward the end of the Napoleonic Wars. Keats writes, quote, O peace, and dost thou with thy presence bless the dwellings of this war-surrounded isle, soothing with placid brow our late distress, making the triple kingdom brightly smile. Joyful I hail thy presence, and I hail the sweet companions that await on thee. Complete my joy, let not my first wish fail. Let the sweet mountain nymph thy favorite be. With England's happiness proclaim Europa's liberty. O Europe, let not sceptred tyrants see that thou must shelter in thy former state. Keep thy chains burst, and boldly say thou art free. Give thy king's law, leave not uncurbed the great. So with the horrors past thou'lt win thy happier fate. End quote. This next one is called Fill for Me a Brimming Bowl. And of course, Keats uses imperfect rhyming a lot, so it's not a big deal. But there's something in this one that's a little bit funny for an American to read, which is that he rhymes the word draft, referring to an amount of a drink, with the word quaffed, meaning to drink. And with a British accent, these two words would rhyme more closely, and with an American accent, they don't. So our cousins whose ancestors never got on the ship will have to forgive us that one. And here he's thinking about a woman, and he starts by saying he wishes he could drink to forget her. And there are a few allusions in this one. One is to Lethe, who in Greek mythology is associated with the underworld, and the river Lethe. She's a nymph or a spirit, and her river is the river of forgetfulness. And it's one of the 5 rivers in the underworld. And toward the end, he mentions Lapland, which is the northernmost and least populated region of Finland. So that's a very cold place. And then he mentions Arno, which is a river in Tuscany. So you can keep those in mind toward the end of this one. Keats writes, quote, fill for me a brimming bowl, and let me in it drown my soul, but put therein some drug designed to banish woman from my mind. For I want not the stream inspiring that heats the sense with lewd desiring, but I want as deep a draught as air from Lethe's waves was quaffed. From my despairing breast to charm the image of the fairest form that ere my reveling eyes beheld, that ere my wandering fancy spelled. 'Tis vain, away I cannot chase the melting softness of that face, the beaminess of those bright eyes, that breast, earth's only paradise. My sight will never more be blessed, for all I see has has lost its zest, nor with delight can I explore the classic page, the muse's lore. Had she but known how beat my heart, and with one smile relieved its smart, I should have felt a sweet relief, I should have felt the joy of grief. Yet as a Tuscan mid the snow of Lapland thinks on sweet Arno, even so forever shall she be the halo of my memory. End quote. This next one is called Written in Disgust of Vulgar Superstition. And this one appears to have been prompted by hearing church bells. And even though I'm not particularly religious, this one seems a little harsh. But maybe the church was a more oppressive cultural force in the early 19th century than it is today. Or at least Keats apparently perceived it that way. Quote, "The church bells toll a melancholy round, calling the people to some other prayers. Some other gloominess, some dreadful cares, more hearkening to the sermon's horrid sound. Surely the mind of man is closely bound in some blind spell, seeing that each one tears himself from fireside joys and Lydian airs and converse high of those with glory crowned. Still they toll, and I should feel a damp, a chill as from a tomb, did I not know that they are dying like an outburnt lamp. That 'tis their sighing, wailing, ere they go into oblivion, that fresh flowers will grow and many glories of immortal stamp." End quote. This next one is titled, "Oh, How I Love on a Fair Summer's Eve." And I had marked off this one because it describes that kind of nice moment in summer when the sun is setting and there's a little breeze and the clouds look nice. And my wife and I now live in a place where we can enjoy these kinds of moments, whereas before we had been living in a big city. And so I know very vividly the kind of moment that he's talking about. Hopefully you do too. Maybe his description will remind you of somewhere that you've been, or hopefully of your own house in the summertime. And he also mentions Milton, which is of course John Milton, and Sidney, who is the less well-known Philip Sidney. And while Milton lived in the 17th century, Philip Sidney lived in the 16th century. And he was a poet and a scholar, but he was also a soldier, which Milton was not. And the poem mentions Sidney's bier, but it's B-I-E-R, which is the platform on which a coffin is carried, rather than the drink that slowly kills you. So in that way, the bier is both the vehicle and the destination. Keats writes, quote, "Oh, how I love on a fair summer's eve, when streams of light pour down the golden west, and on the balmy zephyrs tranquil rest the silver clouds, far, far away, to leave all meaner thoughts, and take a sweet reprieve from little cares, to find with easy quest a fragrant wild with nature's beauty dressed, and there into delight my soul deceive, there warm my breast with patriotic lore, musing on Milton's fate, on Sidney's bier, till their stern forms before me find arise, perhaps on the wing of poesy upsoar, full often dropping a delicious tear when some melodious sorrow spells mine eyes." End quote. This next one is titled, "When I Have Fears That I May Cease to Be." And in this one he uses the word charactery, which is expressing thoughts using characters or symbols of any kind. So basically he means writing, but it's a more broad concept than that. Charactery would include, for example, the use of geoglyphs. In just a few lines, he begins by reflecting on his mortality and his own work, and then he suddenly pivots and he's praising this woman whom he loves. Keats writes, quote, "When I have fears that I may cease to be, before my pen has gleaned my teeming brain, before high-piled books in charactery hold like rich garners the full ripened grain, when I behold upon the night's starred face huge cloudy symbols of a high romance, and think that I may never live to trace their shadows with the magic hand of chance, and when I feel, fair creature of an hour, that I shall never look upon thee more, never have relish in the fairy power of unreflecting love, then on the shore of the wide world I stand alone, and think, till love and fame to nothingness do sink." End quote. This next one refers to a place called Vauxhall, which is a district in London that was originally named after a manor called Foxhall, but over time the name has changed slightly. Or who knows, perhaps maybe the word fox was originally spelled V-A-U-X and pronounced more like Vox. But anyway, it's also known for its gardens, which had been renovated in 1785. And this one is titled, "To a Lady Seen for a Few Moments at Vauxhall." He writes, quote, "Time's sea hath been 5 years at its slow ebb. Long hours have to and fro let creep the sand, since I was tangled in thy beauty's web and snared by the ungloving of thine hand. And yet I never look on midnight sky, but I behold thine eyes' well-memoried light. I cannot look upon the rose's dye, but to thy cheek my soul doth take its flight. I cannot look on any budding flower, but my fond ear in fancy at thy lips, and hearkening for a love sound, doth devour its sweets in the wrong sense. Thou dost eclipse every delight with sweet remembering, and grief unto my darling joys dost bring." End quote. So that poem is called "To a Lady Seen for a Few Moments" at Vauxhall, like I said. And he said it happened 5 years ago, and he was snared by the ungloving of thine hand. So she took off her glove. And I don't think there is anything special about taking off her glove in particular. It's just an example of how a simple gesture can be very effective if a certain person does it in a certain way. But the way this poem captured this fleeting moment of a few seconds when he saw this beautiful woman in the park and she took off her glove and he was really amazed, and then the moment passed and he kept walking with his friend or whatever he was doing. He doesn't know who she is. It's not a woman he's trying to woo or something. He doesn't know her name. There's something special about that, and it reminds me of a friend I had. This is now 15 years ago or something. We were living in a big city, and he said sometimes he would be sitting on the metro. He'd be sitting on the subway, and he'd see a beautiful woman. And of course, you can't go talk to somebody on the subway, but he would just be stealing glances at her like a weirdo. And when her stop came and she was getting off, knowing that she was about to disappear into this massive city and he would never see her again, he would be pulled by the irrational impulse to reach out his hand and say, "I love you." And I do think Keats was exaggerating a little bit here. He might have still remembered this moment 5 years later, but I really doubt that it poisoned all of these different observations of natural beauty that he had. But he gives here a much more poetic description of this feeling, this moment that my friend had, that probably lots of, if not all, young men experience at one time or another. This next one is called "The Human Seasons." Quote, "4 seasons fill the measure of the year. There are 4 seasons in the mind of man. He has his lusty spring, when fancy clear takes in all beauty with an easy span. He has his summer, when luxuriously spring's honeyed cud of youthful thought he loves to ruminate, and by such dreaming high is nearest unto heaven. Quiet coves his soul has in its autumn, when his wings he furleth close, contented so to look on mists in idleness, to let fair things pass by unheeded as a threshold brook. He has his winter too of pale misfeature, or else he would forego his mortal nature." End quote. And the notion of there being 4 seasons to life is of course not new, but it's nice to hear Keats's take on it. This next one is a little strange. You'll have to see what you think of it. It's titled, "Why Did I Laugh Tonight?" He writes, quote, "Why did I laugh tonight? No voice will tell. No god, no demon of severe response designs to reply from heaven or from hell. Then to my human heart I turn at once. Heart, thou and I are here, sad and alone. Say, wherefore did I laugh? O mortal pain, O darkness, darkness, ever must I moan, to question heaven and hell and heart in vain. Why did I laugh? I know this being's lease, my fancy to its utmost blisses spreads, yet would I on this very midnight cease, and the world's gaudy ensigns see in shreds. Verse, fame, and beauty are intense indeed, but death intenser, death is life's high meed." End quote. So he laughed for some reason, and he's trying to understand why, because he doesn't know. This next one is titled, "Bright Star, Would I Were Steadfast as Thou Art." And in this one, he starts by wishing he was as steady, as unchanging, as steadfast as a star. And then again, he connects that to a woman that he loves. And he uses the word eremite, which is a Christian hermit. Quote, "Bright star, would I were steadfast as thou art, not in lone splendor hung aloft the night, and watching with eternal lids apart, like nature's patient, sleepless eremites, the moving waters at their priest-like task of pure ablution round earth's human shores, or gazing on the new soft-fallen mask of snow upon the mountains and the moors. No, yet still steadfast, still unchangeable, pillowed upon my fair love's ripening breast, to feel forever its soft swell and fall, awake forever in a sweet unrest, still, still, to hear her tender taken breath, and so live ever, or else swoon to death." End quote. And this next passage that I'm going to read is from the beginning of the first canto of a longer narrative poem called The Fall of Hyperion, a Vision. And Hyperion in Greek mythology was one of the 12 Titans, and his name means he who goes before. And he's talking about how everybody can imagine things, but only a poet can articulate those imaginings, those visions. Keats writes, quote, "Fanatics have their dreams wherewith they weave a paradise for a sect. The savage, too, from forth the loftiest fashion of his sleep guesses at heaven. Pity these have not traced upon vellum or wild Indian leaf the shadows of melodious utterance, but bare of laurel they live, dream, and die. For poesy alone can tell her dreams, with the fine spell of words alone can save imagination from the sable chain and dumb enchantment." End quote. And now I'll read a few passages from the 6 odes that, as I mentioned, are thought to be some of Keats's best writing. In the Ode on a Grecian Urn, he writes at one point, quote, "Heard melodies are sweet, but those unheard are sweeter. Therefore, ye soft pipes, play on, not to the sensual ear, but more endeared. Pipe to the spirit, ditties of no tone." End quote. Unheard melodies. In the Ode to Psyche, he describes encountering a personification of Psyche. I think it's supposed to be sort of the god of the psyche. And he's talking about being a priest to that god and building a temple to it. And then he writes, quote, "Yes, I will be thy priest, and build a fane in some untrodden region of my mind, where branched thoughts, new grown with pleasant pain, instead of pines, shall murmur in the wind. Far, far around shall those dark clustered trees fledge the wild ridged mountains steep by steep, and there by zephyrs, streams, and birds and bees the moss-lain dryads shall be lulled to sleep. And in the midst of this wide quietness a rosy sanctuary will I dress with the wreathed trellis of a working brain, with buds and bells and stars without a name. With all the gardener fancy air could feign, who breeding flowers will never breed the same, and there shall be for thee all soft delight that shadowy thought can win, a bright torch and a casement ope at night to let the warm love in." End quote. In a section from the Ode on Melancholy, he says, if you're feeling bad, look at something beautiful. Look at a rose. Look at some peonies, which are another kind of flower. Look at a rainbow. But he also says, if your wife gets mad at you, then hold her hand and look deeply into her eyes. Which obviously that's not quite enough. If your wife is mad at you about something, you have to do more than that. But honestly, that's not bad advice. That wouldn't be a bad start. You just have to say something afterwards. He writes, quote, "But when the melancholy fit shall fall sudden from heaven like a weeping cloud that fosters the droop-headed flowers all and hides the green hill in an April shroud, then glut thy sorrow on a morning rose, or on the rainbow of the salt sand-wave, or on the wealth of globed peonies, or if thy mistress some rich anger shows, imprison her soft hand and let her rave, and feed deep, deep upon her peerless eyes." End quote. And there are 2 more, not from the odes that I had marked off that I somehow skipped. He writes, "To a cat," quote, "Cat, who hast passed thy grand climacteric, how many mice and rats hast in thy days destroyed, how many titbits stolen. Gaze with those bright languid segments green, and prick those velvet ears, but prithee do not stick thy latent talents in me, and upraise thy gentle mew, and tell me all thy phrase of fish and mice and rats and tender chick. Nay, look not down, nor lick thy dainty wrists, for all the wheezy asthma, and for all thy tail's tip is nicked off. And though the fists of many a maid have given thee many a maul, still is that fur as soft as when the lists in youth thou enteredst on glass-bottled wall." End quote. And I like this one because when I was a kid, we always had cats at our house. And now as an adult, we have not 2, but 3 cats in our house. My wife loves cats. And we had 2 because they don't want you to adopt one because the one can get lonely by itself. And my wife would sometimes say, maybe we should get a third cat so that when one of the other two cats dies, they're not old, by the way. Our other two cats are quite young. When one of those two cats dies, then they'll be all alone. And if we try to get a new cat then they'll be traumatized in two ways. One, by having their friend die, and two, by there now being a new cat in the house. Whereas if we get them acclimated to a third cat now, then it won't be quite as big a deal for them. And I always said, come on, 3 cats is too much. We can't have 3 cats. 2 is fine. And then one of our friends told us that she knew somebody who was giving kittens away. And so now we have 3 cats. But this poem is nice because in the same way that reading old writing, especially writing that was written a long time ago, not writing that was written about old times, but writing originally written a long time ago, shows us something about the people of those times. But it's harder to have access to what the animals of those times were like, because obviously they can't write anything. But every once in a while you get a glimpse of it through the writings of people from those times. And here you have Keats showing us that cats haven't changed much either. He says, gaze with those bright languid segments green and prick those velvet ears, but prithee do not stick thy latent talons in me. So he's looking at the cat's eyes and that bright and languid gaze that cats have. But he's also saying, prithee do not stick thy latent talons in me. He's saying, please don't sink your claws into my leg. And there I don't think he means to scratch. I think he means that thing that cats do where they can be sitting on you, and even if they're having a nice time, you're petting them or whatever, they can slowly sink their claws into your leg and it sort of hurts, but you don't want to move them. And also if you try to move them, it's just going to hurt more. And so he's saying to the cat, please don't do that. And the last poem that I'm going to read is titled On Sitting Down to Read King Lear once again. So he's reading Shakespeare, and he uses the name Albion, which is an old name for England or for Britain. And he writes, quote, O golden-tongued romance with serene lute, fair-plumed siren, queen of far away, leave melodizing on this wintry day, shut up thine olden pages and be mute. Adieu, for once again the fierce dispute betwixt damnation and impassioned clay must I burn through, once more humbly essay the bittersweet of this Shakespearean fruit. Chief poet, and ye clouds of Albion, begetters of our deep eternal theme, when through the old oak forest I am gone, let me not wander in a barren dream, but when I am consumed in the fire, give me the new phoenix wings to fly at my desire. End quote. And I just noticed that there's one more section from the letters that I had marked to read, but that I skipped. Keats writes, quote, I am ambitious of doing the world some good. If I should be spared, that may be the work of maturer years. In the interval, I will essay to reach to as high a summit in poetry as the nerve bestowed upon me will suffer. The faint conceptions I have of poems to come brings the blood frequently into my forehead. All I hope is that I may not lose all interest in human affairs, that the solitary indifference I feel for applause even from the finest spirits will not blunt any acuteness of vision I may have. I do not think it will. I feel assured I should write from the mere yearning and fondness I have for the beautiful, even if my night's labors should be burnt every morning and no eye ever shine upon them. But even now I am perhaps not speaking from myself, but from some character in whose soul I now live. End quote. That's a very sincere creative impulse. I feel assured I should write from the mere yearning and fondness I have for the beautiful, even if my night's labors should be burnt every morning and no eye ever shine upon them. Those are the poems and passages that I wanted to show you from John Keats's writing. And if you're used to reading poetry, I hope you enjoyed listening to this and hearing my thoughts about it. And if you're not accustomed to reading poetry, maybe because you didn't know how to approach it or never thought to try, I hope that this gave you an idea of how to approach it. There's no wrong way, really, but you don't need a special education to read poetry. You can just open up a volume and start reading through poems. And if you read a poem and it doesn't hit you particularly, then that's fine. You can just move on. You might read it again later and it might click in a different way. But you don't have to force anything, because if you read some poetry by a real poet, probably you're eventually going to hit something that resonates with you. And then you can just mark that one off or mark off that section, kind of like I did. And in the meantime, as you're reading a poem that maybe doesn't inspire you to show it to someone else, you can still enjoy the craftsmanship of a single line having been put together very carefully, of the words used, of the meter, because there is lots of work that is done very thoughtlessly. but a real volume of poetry was thought over very carefully, and that by itself is something to appreciate. The human cognition and industry that goes into trying to make something beautiful. Even the greatest writers can't succeed every time, but also sometimes the beauty in a poem is not immediately obvious. It can take a second reading, or sometimes it can require years to pass. People are affected differently by poems at different times in their life, and so a poem that is opaque to a teenager might be profound to someone in their 40s or 50s. And there's another aspect of poetry, which is that it is one of the forms of high refinement of something that we do every day. Every day you speak, you talk to people, you use language, you write. And poetry is more than a novel, a spoken form of literature. For poetry, the sound of the writing is relevant in a way that the sound of prose writing is not quite as relevant. Obviously, a good writer of prose still cares about the sound, but this is weighted differently from how it's weighted in poetry. Speaking is also something that we do every day, and we don't think very much about how we speak. But poetry brings into very clear focus the height of the quality that speech can potentially reach. Now, we obviously can't go around talking the way that John Keats writes, though even John Keats didn't talk that way, as we can see in his letters. His letters are clearly more conversational than his poetry, because to write a single line of poetry takes a lot of work. Very few people, if anyone, can just improvise that. But reading poetry and listening to it can make us think about our own words more. If all of the words that we spoke throughout the day were written down on a piece of paper, as if they were a poem, how nice of a poem would that be? Not that we should speak poetically, but we should think about the words that we should use. We should be conscious of what's coming out of our mouth. It shouldn't be reflexive. It should be deliberate and chosen. Do we use profanities too much? Do we use cliches too much? How could we make that daily speech poem of all the things that we said throughout the day be nicer to read? Because for all of the big plans that people have about what they want to do in their work and how they're going to change the world, the major effect that you have on the world in a continuous way is through the day-to-day interactions that you have with people regularly and how you impact those people. And your speech to those people is a major factor in that. Though, of course, our life work matters as well, whatever that might be. If you enjoyed listening to this podcast, I hope you will send it to a thoughtful friend who you think will benefit from it. And I hope you will go over to my website, volrathpublishing.com, and pick up the copy of Mary Shelley's Frankenstein that I have published. I prepared it with original cover art, 97 footnotes throughout the text that explain some of the historical, literary, and geographical references that Mary Shelley makes, some of the more unusual vocabulary that she uses. My edition has excellent print quality. I have it at a good price with free shipping. And my goal was to create an edition that I would be glad to have on my shelf, and I'm pleased to have been able to do that. Of all the physical objects that I own, my library is probably the most valuable to me, and I'm really glad to be able to contribute to making your library a little bit better, which I'm sure this edition of Frankenstein will do. If you haven't read Frankenstein, you absolutely should order a copy now and do so. If you have read it but you don't own a copy, you should have a copy in your house in case a friend or a family member wants to read it. And if you have already read it and you already own a copy, then you should get my edition as a gift to a friend or a family member so that they can enjoy this great book. It's one of these books that I think everybody should read. It is more relevant today than it was when it was first published over 200 years ago. It is a forceful warning about the destructive power of technology and about how easy it may be for us to build something that could destroy us. So go over to my website right now and get yourself a copy. I'll put it in the mail today. Thank you very much for listening to this episode. I hope you're well. Farewell until next time. Take care and happy reading.